Historical Museum and Art Center. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning.
We've started last week and been talking about agriculture here in southeast New Mexico and the history of agriculture and so forth. And you'd like to continue on with that. Where would you like to take us today?
Well, I think we'll go with where I left off last week. We were talking about Charles Eddy, namesake of Eddy County.
Right.
Of course, he was originally from, he's from New York. He moved with his brother out to northern Colorado, where they learned how to run cattle ranches. And they figured it out, and then they decided to move down to what was then Lincoln County. And the reason for that is because they read about the Lincoln County Wars, and while most people were shocked at all the violence, they realized that the area, despite the violence, was perfect for cattle ranching. So they did precisely that. But then they had some issues. The first, and all the issues seemed to happen in one year, 1886. 1886, there was a major drought that led to what was known as the Big Die.
Very appropriate name, it sounds like.
It was a really bad year for cattle. A lot of cattle died from the drought, from a lack of water, a lack of rain. And then the winter made up for that with a lot of snow, which killed a lot more cattle. And the year was also nationally a bad year for cattle prices. So it was two really bad hits at the same time for the ranches in the area. So in 1886, he met up with Pat Garrett, and they talked about what they could do and what their options were. And they realized that there's a lot of water going down the Pecos River that's just going into Texas that they could use.
Okay.
And so in 1886, they decided to form a partnership and to focus instead on growing crops. They had some ideas of what they could potentially grow. They decided over the next few years they would try to experiment with various things. So in 1886, Pat Garrett and Charles Eddy formed a partnership. Then over the next few years, they formed various companies to try to develop agriculture in the area, first being the Pecos Valley Land and Ditch Company in 1887. And for that, they went out and found investors. They sold stocks, they sold bonds. They tried to attract a lot of funding from various areas, one being Colorado Springs, and that's where they found James Hagerman.
Okay. Another name that we are familiar with in this part of the state now.
Very familiar with, because he's the namesake for Hagerman Heights. He's the namesake for the town of Hagerman, for the Hagerman Canal and Roswell. A lot of things were named after him, and a lot of things were eventually renamed that were originally named after him, like the Hagerman Dam that was located on the east side of Carlsbad. That fed that controlled the water for what eventually became Hagerman Heights. So there was a lot named after him, and his contribution at first was just funding, because he was someone of wealth and means from the east who came to Colorado for health reasons, and he invested his money and bought a silver mine that in the 1880s, 1890s yielded $5 million worth of silver.
Wow.
And over the course of the next decade, he wound up investing $2.5 million of that in Eddy County. So their plan was to build dams, canals, water reservoirs, ditches, and to find all this land, develop this land, and then eventually sell the land to people who want to colonize the area.
Mm-hmm.
So they did precisely that. Among the various things they formed in 1888, they formed the Eddy Townsite Company, named after Charles Eddy, the person who was head of the company.
Okay.
Which created an interesting pattern of things being named after Eddy, because he was the owner of the company that started the things.
Well, yeah.
So eventually there's Eddy County, too. All because Charles Eddy.
Right. Now the town of, was there a town named Eddy, or did he name? Or I think you said this. There was a township or a homestead area that was formed that was named after him.
A townsite company.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So basically, it was land that it was 1888. So it was land that the Pecos Valley Land and Ditch Company owned, that they transferred over to a subsidiary, the Eddy Townsite Company. There's a lot of that going on, too.
Yeah.
It was, when you think of like Standard Oil and companies like that, where they had sort of that monopoly from producing all the way to distributing, Charles Eddy was trying that locally, but with land.
Gotcha. Now,
so they formed the...
Go ahead. I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
Well, they formed the Townsite Company, and then they immediately divided up the empty land into lots, and then the Townsite Company used the construction efforts by the Land and Ditch Company, although that later became the Pecos Irrigation and Investments Company in 1888, to build everything. They built improvements, they built water, they laid out the town, and they were working on Avalon and McMillan dams at this point to build water reservoirs.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the Hagerman Dam, which was turned into renamed the Tansel Dam after an investor I believe from Chicago. That was built there, and they installed turbines, and they got electricity for the entire town.
It's hard to imagine that now, because it doesn't look like there's enough water to do that, but they were able to make that happen. That was in Hagerman they did that, or in the
that was in Eddy.
In Eddy.
Later renamed Carlsbad.
Okay. Well, that's what I was going to ask you. I said, because Eddy, I know we're in Eddy County. I don't remember a town named Eddy, so that's where you're going to tell us about now. Whatever happened to that town that called Eddy?
Well, the town was renamed. There was an effort to rename it partly because they knew that they could attract people to visit a town named Carlsbad, because everybody knew Carlsbad in Europe was a great place for their mineral water.
Okay.
So if you go to the Carlsbad in New Mexico, you'd also get good mineral water for the hot baths and all that. And also, too, at that point, Charles Eddy had lost interest in Eddy County and was focusing on the other side of the mountains, so it made sense to not have things named after him anymore.
Yeah, he wasn't as important anymore. So the town that you're talking about that was laid out and was created and all of the other aspects of it, that eventually became Carlsbad, and what is now Carlsbad, New Mexico.
And it's interesting to look at some of the other communities south of there and how they came about, because, of course, there's Loving, the town of Loving. That's in Carlsbad, or South Carlsbad. That was originally a colony for Swiss immigrants.
Okay.
So all those land grants that they accumulated, like the desert's lands, or homesteads, not land grants, all those homesteads that they accumulated, like with the Desert Land Act, where you could get 640 acres for $800. They parceled that up to 40-acre lots and sold those to people from Switzerland who moved over here and tried to take up farming.
Okay.
And the town of Malaga, south of that, was mostly Italian immigrants. And they came over as well in the early 1890s. However, all this met some significant setbacks.
Okay.
First being that in 1893, there was a major flood that knocked out a lot of the improvements that they built, which really hurt the farmers because they lost Avalon Dam, they lost all that water,
Mm-hmm.
and that meant having to raise a lot of funds just to repair it because it was still owned by the company.
Right.
But it was also the panic of 1893, which was a bad year overall for investments and for finding funds and money. And it was the same year, too, that Charles Eddy had quit all the various Pecos companies. At this point, it was the Pecos Irrigation and Improvement Company. In 1893, they also had the Pecos Valley Railway. So he quit all that, even though he still owned the a majority of the bank in Carlsbad.
Mm-hmm.
So he left. His new focus was building a railroad from El Paso to Amarillo through Lincoln County. So he sort of lost interest in Eddy County, and Hagerman took over. James Hagerman.
He took over Carlsbad and the developments and the repairs and all of those things that needed to be done.
And eventually the Pecos Valley and Northwestern Railway.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, of course, the railroad. That's it. That was interesting too. The railroads they weren't as profitable as they had hoped, so they created the Pecos Valley Railroad that ran from Pecos to Carlsbad. They wanted to expand it, but they couldn't get funding to expand the railroad, so they established a second company, the Pecos Valley Northeastern Railway, which bought out the old company, and that got them to from Carlsbad to Roswell. And then they eventually formed the Pecos Valley and the Pecos Valley and Northern Texas Railway that got from Roswell to Amarillo.
Mm. Now Eddy was involved in this?
No, he was not involved in it at all. He was involved in the Lincoln County Railroad that was going to go from El Paso to Alamogordo to Amarillo.
Okay.
And he was trying to get the Rock Island Railway to fund it all and to eventually buy it out, while Hagerman, his goal was to eventually get the Santa Fe Railway to buy out his Pecos Valley Railway
Sure.
lines and everything.
Yeah.
And he actually succeeded in 1900. The Santa Fe bought him out.
Right. That is all just amazing. And so it started out with cattle, and then because of the die-out, I think you said is what they called it.
The big die.
The big die. There's a shift to agriculture because, look, there's a river. We have water. Let's do that. But and then we need people to work, so let's bring in people from Europe and settle them out here. And then eventually they shift to railroads, and it's all just interesting how that, because of investments and what's successful and what's not successful, and interacting with Mother Nature, how things kind of shift depending on what seems to be working at the particular time.
And at the end of the day, none of it worked out. And there's still agriculture in the area. They tried various things. Cotton, that was successful. Corn, somewhat successful. Tobacco was not successful.
Mm-hmm.
Alfalfa was very successful.
Right. We still see that today.
But a lot of their early efforts failed in part because the irrigation system that they built was not sturdy.
Right. So
it
you'd
washed out whenever it flooded.
You'd have floods, and it would wash everything out. Nowadays, you see mostly wells that drive the irrigation system for a lot of the farms that still grow crops in this area. Although there's still a lot of irrigation. I mean, there's still a lot of that going on too.
And there's that because they eventually convinced the federal government and the Reclamation Service to step in, because there was yet another major flood in 1904. Avalon was completely destroyed again. Mm-hmm. And that too, there was during these floods and reconstructions, there was added strife between Hagerman and Eddy, because although the irrigation ditches and canals were built on the Pecos company lands, Lake McMillan was actually built on Eddy Bissell Cattle Company land, so he was getting free water out of that.
Well, I would think, yeah. That's truly amazing. Hey, we have about a minute left. I'm sure we can continue on with this or something else next week, but you do have, the museum is open, and you do have a nice exhibit you'd like people to come and see.
Yes, the Fashionable Founding Fathers Menswear of 1905 on display in the Art Center. And you can see that by visiting the museum Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 1 and 2 to 4. Unfortunately, we are going to be closed this Saturday, but that should be the only closure that will happen in the foreseeable future.
Gotcha. So the Fashionable Founding Fathers fashions would have been about a little after the time period that you've just been talking about, coming out of the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. Yes,
so many people were really, really fashionable, but some people still wore the clothes from this era.
That's right. That's right. Michael, as always, it is fun to talk and learn more about the history of Artesia, and we look forward to chatting with you again next week.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot. Michael Rebman from the Artesia Historical Museum and Art Center. That's going to wrap up the show for today. Clay and Buck are taking over. We'll